Okay, I know people are still streaming in, but as you do, I'd like to welcome you again to PNP Live. My name is Chelsea Lake. I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore. So before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be dropping in the chat to purchase Living Queer History, Remembrance and Belonging in a Southern City. You can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A, which can be found along the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions, but I apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We are delighted to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, simply click on the live transcripts option, which is also along the bottom of your screen. Now it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's speakers. Samantha Rosenthal is Associate Professor of History and Coordinator of the Public History Concentration at Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia. She is the author of 2 books, Living Queer History, Remembrance and Belonging in a Southern City, and Beyond Hawaii, Native Labor in the Pacific World. They are co-founder of the Southwest Virginia LGBTQ+ History Project, a nationally recognized queer public history initiative. Her work has received recognition from the National Council on Public History, the Oral History Association, the Committee on LGBT History, the American Society for Environmental History, and the Working Class Studies Association. She will be in conversation with Dr. Aaliyah M. Brown, who is the National Women's History Museum's Vice President of Programs and Chief Curator. She is a public historian, curator, and writer whose work explores the convergence of Black women's textile art, political movements, labor, and technology. Her current manuscript in progress, Disrupting the Loop of Recovery, Black Women's Engagement with Textile Art and Political Thought, 1930 to 1970, unfolds the history of Black women textile artists in Alabama and Mississippi who use their work to visualize political thought and as a source for organizing solidarity economies. Samantha and Dr. Brown, the screen is yours.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that really kind and thoughtful introduction. And I have to say that I'm so glad to be here to discuss Dr. Samantha Rosenthal's work. But before we begin, we wanted to talk a little bit about the unionization of politics and prose. We want to take a moment to acknowledge the workers of politics and prose who not too long ago formed the district's first unionized bookstore. We know that bookstores are part of healthy communities. They're also portals, places where we can raise consciousness and think and learn together about creating a more equitable community, especially in the face of disparity, displacement, and dispossession. We are grateful that because of their work, we get to discuss living queer history in a public forum. We stand in solidarity with the workers. And if you all want to learn more about the work that they've done, you can follow the link here. So now I'm really excited to begin. And also I'm in my home in Washington, D.C., so you will hear the sounds and rhythms of Washington, D.C. But anyway, welcome, Samantha. It's so good to talk with you.
I'm so happy to have this conversation with you.
Wonderful. So to begin, I'd like to invite you to read a few pages to open up our discussion. So if you could read the passage that you had marked out, that would be really wonderful to get us started.
Okay, thank you so much. So yeah, I feel like this passage is my closest summation in short of what I mean by living queer history. And we can dive more into talking about that. I believe that queer history is a living practice and that it lives on in spaces of remembrance and belonging. When I walk Roanoke's paved streets and dirt alleyways today, I encounter the remnants, some might even say the queer ghosts, of an almost forgotten past. The work of queer public history is to make and remake these spaces of queer historical consciousness, to foster a renewed sense of togetherness and queer belonging around a shared understanding of the past. Our engagement with local histories also opens up new worlds of possibility for our collective future, for who we might become and how we might live together in the city as queer and trans people. For this work is not just about historical research, interpretation, and preservation. It's also about surviving the current moment and organizing for our well-being. I helped to found this project because I had a personal wish. I wanted to find my people, a queer and trans community in Southwest Virginia. I thought I could use queer public history as a way to find other queers, make new friends, and build community. I didn't realize that I would also fall in love with another project leader. In the years since our founding in 2015, we've established a new community here. We are friends, some of us are lovers, we are collaborators, sometimes across great differences and disparities of age, race, class, gender, and sexuality. In rallying people around the celebration of queer history, we make space for LGBTQ people in the present. In our bar crawl, which is one of our wild events, we took up city space and reclaimed historically queer spaces in the city for one night, for our enjoyment, for our pleasure. By making space for LGBTQ history, we seek not just to rescue the past, but to create present and future spaces for our own survival. We make space for queer people just to be. This is what I believe queer public history work can do, not just the commemoration and memorialization of queer pasts, but the reclamation of historically queer spaces and ways of being in space together. I want us to be our beautiful selves. I want us to love our neighborhood. I want us to gallivant around downtown in heels and sequins, if that's what you want to do. I do not want us to fall victim to displacement, assimilation, or erasure.
That was gorgeous. Like, first of all, amazing writing was happening in this book. So I have to say that. So thank you for starting us out with a really wonderful passage. I'm so glad that you started with that because I read this book several ways, especially that passage. I read it as, like, of course, a public history. I read it as a manifesto. I also read it, and probably like the way that it was most compelling to me as a love letter to past, present, and future queer Roanoke. Can you tell us about how this love emerged and if you were thinking about it as a love letter?
Yeah, I do think that this is a book about love. There is a love story, literally, that weaves through the book, what I read sort of hinted at that, where I fell in love with another community historian. We were working on this work together, and it was changing us as we did the work and fell in love. But I think more broadly, the book is about a love of place. And I think that there are so many different ways to fall in love with a place, but I can only speak from my experience of falling in love with a place. The first time I thought about that concept was when I was in New York City, where I spent much of my 20s. And the more I learned about local history, what happened on this street corner, on that street corner, I realized that the city was becoming more familiar to me in the way that, say, going on dates with someone, a person becomes more familiar. And you realize what is so lovable about a place as it is revealed through all the layers of pasts and pasts erased and pasts resurrected. It's just layers upon layers of stories. Roanoke, Virginia is an interesting place because it's not a place that people think of initially as queer, right? We're here on the edge of Appalachia in the South, in the Bible Belt, down the road from Jerry Falwell's headquarters in Lynchburg. And so people don't initially think of this region as queer, and I didn't think of it as queer when I moved here from New York 8 years ago now. But doing the queer history work for me as a queer person, trying to find my place in a new city, it revealed to me the past, present, future of a place that is so animated by queer histories and memories, as well as utopian longings and dreamings of what can be. And now when I walk around the city, and even in the house that I live in, which is in the neighborhood, everywhere I look, I see stories that are familiar to me now, and they're related to people, some of the elders that I've met. It's their stories, and so I think all told, it's created a kind of fabric of life here that is a love story to me. And there's this line in the intro where I'd say something to the effect of, doing queer history work doesn't just make the city more livable, but it makes it more lovable. And I really believe that.
It certainly came through. And that was one of the beauties of reading the book. And to carry on with these themes of like place and space, can you help orient us a little bit more to Roanoke, Virginia? I know you gave us like the geographical and kind of like the socio-political landscape of Roanoke, Virginia, but can you tell us a little bit more about like what your town is and what the queer history is?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing I could say, which is not probably what people want to hear, but that I think Roanoke is very unremarkable. And the reason I say that is because in writing the book, I had to face the question of, after discovering all of this queer stuff, the question of whether Roanoke is exceptional in its queerness as a small southern Appalachian city, or is it actually just exemplary of what you would find in Knoxville or Asheville or Charleston or any other city like that? And I think it's the latter. So, so first of all, the introduction to Roanoke is that, it's a messy place, just like any other community. It's a forgotten and looked over place, like much of Appalachia. It's a place animated by queerness. The first chapter of my book is hundreds of years of history of queerness in this space. But I write that hoping that readers will think about how that could also be true of their small town or city anywhere else in the country too. I think all of our communities are extremely queer spaces. When you meet the person who is the storyteller and they reveal it to you, when you happen upon the building that used to be a gathering spot, it's all there in every community. So I thought the task here in Roanoke was just to show what does that look like here in our city. But okay, so that said about it being unremarkable, that's kind of that's like my scholarly talk. But like for me, living here is quite remarkable in that I've chosen to put down roots here and make this my home, which in the book I talk about that journey because I am a New Yorker and I came here with stereotypes about what it would be like here. And I thought it would be uninhabitable to my queerness and to my transness. But What there is here, just quickly, is the earliest known gay bar that we found opened in the 50s here, and there have been a flurry of bars and discos and gathering spots to this day. Then most queer history is not found in those buildings, which was a surprise to me. And it's mostly going on in people's homes and apartments, and on the soccer field and softball field where you find a lot of the lesbians. And there's a long history of trans groups here that have been invisibilized by the broad narratives of LGBT history. And I have a whole chapter trying to resurrect those stories. There's a large Black queer population which has been invisibilized by the whiteness of the dominant LGBT spaces and narratives. And so we are a city of 100,000 people that's not thought of as a very queer space, but we've been chipping away for 7 years at trying to uncover these stories, and it just reveals more and more depth and layers of people and places that some have been lifted up, and some have been marginalized, and some have been invisibilized, and some have been memorialized. And it's just ongoing. I feel like if I live here for the rest of my life, we'll constantly be uncovering more of that history, which is remarkable, and I hope inspiring to people elsewhere in the country to think about what it looks like to do queer history work in their home communities.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, this work was so inspiring. One, in the way that you described the quotidian and just being able to look at a street or where folks cruised, or like you were saying, like a baseball field, or like the quotidian in life, and looking at the magical queerness in that. And then also looking at the complicated layers of whose lives we memorialize or see as what is a queer story or what is a trans story. So I think the methodology, which I'll ask you a little bit about later, is really important for how we do public history. But before like getting into methodology, just again to kind of fan over some of the really cool sentences in, well, like fluttery that maybe have flutters. There's one place where you write, "Queer history made me queer." And I just really liked the transformative power and voice behind that sentence. And it reminded me of Octavia Butler's line, like, "All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you." And she finishes that with, "The only lasting truth is change." So I wanted to hear your thinking, one, behind that line that you wrote, but also around like your thinkings and feelings about being changed by history, and you actually changing the way that we do public history.
Yeah, I think that this has been an interesting and exciting aspect of this work for me, because like you, I was trained in the academy, although we've both also learned from other non-academic worlds, which we could talk more about. And I think that part of the intro where I'm talking about queer history made me queer wrestles with that too. It's like a little bit of book learning and like what I read in graduate school and how that was shaping my thinking, but then it's also sitting down with elders in my community and hearing a different tale from them. And how do I take all of these different stories and different ways of thinking about queerness and thinking about the past, and how does it reflect back upon me when I look in the mirror at myself, and when I wake up in the morning? And I think about, what kind of queer am I? Am I queer? When I first moved here and we started this project in 2015, I was nervous about even claiming that. I think I say that in the introduction. I was like, I wasn't the G, the L, the B, or the T. I mean, maybe I was the cue. I'm so grateful the cue is there. But I was nervous about claiming space for myself within that, as if I didn't know enough yet, which is not it's not a fair way to think about that. But my process was thinking like, oh, I'm not sure I know enough yet about what queer is to claim that identity for myself. And I threw myself into working with this community and doing this project. First, sort of as an outsider, moving here as a New Yorker, as a Jew, as a white person, as a largely closeted person. And then over the past 7 years, continuing to do the same work in the same city with the same community, but as I have come out again and again as trans, as a lesbian, etc. So, so queer history made me queer is a recognition that I couldn't have taken this journey that I have. I wouldn't be inhabiting the kind of queerness that I am sitting here right now in Roanoke, Virginia, without the engagement with the queer history all around me and the elders and the local community. So for example, I was, and this gets into more of the personal kind of memoir stuff in the book, but like I was very resistant to the idea of being trans for a while. I mean, I don't say that exactly in the book, but I really wanted to carve out a space of like femininity, being a feminine man. And that's where I was the first few years when I was living here. And meeting trans elders, particularly older trans women who got involved in the project and told their stories through oral histories, I started to see more aspects of myself and be okay with aspects of myself that was coming out of their mouths. And thinking like, oh, I can be that. And it's kind of remarkable. I probably could read a bunch of scholarly books about transness and not come to that, but sitting across from an older trans woman and bringing me to tears with that realization of similitude, that kind of broke me down, and I ended up coming out. Like really within the spaces of the history project and doing this work, I came out. And I was held by like these people that were involved in the history work when I came out. So I'm kind of talking a lot around your answer here, but like, or any question. But like also like when I go back to New York City now, I feel less sure of myself holding my body, moving through spaces as a trans woman in New York, even though you'd think that New York would be a better place than Roanoke, Virginia, to be a out trans woman. But the fact is that like I have come out of my cocoon in this environment, surrounded by this community. My transness is Southern born, it's Appalachia born, strangely, even though I was a New Yorker for much of my life. And what it means is that when I move through these spaces in Roanoke, I, I, I'm living in the queer history. I'm living queer history, here in a way that I don't have those same touchstones and familiarity with how my queerness and transness intersects with the spaces of New York, because I was straight and cis there. So anyway, I mean, these are some of the realizations that I've come to doing this work, and what it's led me to is to think about theoretically and write about in the book about this broader question of like, what does it mean for any queer people to do queer history, to engage with the past? We can't have our white lab coats on, as I say in the introduction, right? We can't, as much as we want to believe in this myth of objectivity and say the history is, I'm here and the history is out there and it just needs to be told factually, like that objective truth. In my book, I argue forcefully that that's impossible when you are part of the community that is impacted by and tangled up with the histories that you're telling. And so it's not just me, but as I write in the book, other people, other young people involved in the project have also found themselves in the work. And so we do the history in ways that's shaped by who we are and who we want to be and who we need to be and what do we need, what do we want and need that history to be. And then the history reflects back at us and makes us question, what does it mean to be queer in this space? What does it mean to be trans? So it's a feedback loop that I think is really beautiful.
That is absolutely beautiful and powerful and empowering. It's more than the history that most folks are privy to in even undergraduate or graduate courses. So I can imagine how like transformative the students' lives, like this work was for your students. I also want to share with the audience, please feel free to add your comments and questions and answers. We'll get to them towards the end, but we want to make sure your voices are heard even in this digital space. We would have loved to be with you in person, but we're really grateful for this digital space. So please go ahead and feel free to interact. But so getting back to our conversation, one of the things that really stood out to me, you've already kind of pointed out too, is like how messy it is to do queer history. Like I think one of the notes that I wrote was like theorizing mess. So, you know, I mean, in so many ways, it's like personal and malleable and unstable rather than rigid. It's very intimate rather than distant and clinical. Can you share more about this praxis of messiness and how it addresses traditional history and like what we gain out of the mess?
I like that, Aaliyah. I'm going to take that praxis of messiness. Yeah, I think, you know, first of all, it's for me as someone who is trained in, who has a PhD in history, um, and I write in the book about the kind of the different ways that PhD operates in doing the community work, the kind of power it wields. The L.H. Stallings calls it a pimpo degree, and talks about the ways that academics um, who are writing about sex or engaging in a kind of sex work, which is something that's really made me think a lot about um, what what does it mean to be a historian doing this work. But then, I can't ever take the PhD hat off. I try to make that clear when I even though I'm part of the community, the queer community, it's always there. But the question of like being a historian, everyone involved in the project is a historian, and that's a realization that is different than what I learned during my PhD. Academic historians are trained to hold the written word above any other form of evidence, which is hogwash, because people can write down whatever they want. There's no reason to think that it would be more truthful than, say, someone's verbal memories, storytelling, oral histories. So making that more messy is something that I think is to queer it. And to approach the queer past with more humility and empathy is to let go of some of that archival impulse, particularly in queer history, because the archives tend to be, criminal records and, the stuff in the newspapers, which, I try to read against the grain of that, to pull out like trans sex worker stories from the newspapers where they're just talking about being arrested and stuff. But yeah, so And then there's the messiness of doing community-based work where we're trying to do history as a team, not as individuals. We're trying to make decisions horizontally, which is the kind of praxis that I learned through engagement with anarchists and like when I was working with Occupy Wall Street, when I lived in New York and stuff like that, thinking about horizontality, thinking about what democracy really looks like in public history. It's not so simple as just saying shared authority, which is the kind of buzzword of public historians. And so some of the messiness is like when an elder's sitting at one of our meetings, like I talk about this in one of the chapters, some elders at the meeting, and someone says, I don't think we should use the term queer because that's derogatory for me. And then a young historian in our group saying, hell no, that's like how I identify. That term is so important to me, we're going to use it. And having these cross-generational conversations, generations across experience. Language is so messy in queer communities because people fight over the acronym, LGBTQIA plus, like what are we going to put in there or not put in there? So like in the chapter about the whiteness of queerness, the young Black queer women who organized that event, I talk about it there, wanted to call the event the Black LGBTQIA plus experience. And the Black queer elders were like, this event is about our history, our stories. We don't want you to call it that. That acronym means nothing to us. Why can't we just say gay? And so just having these conversations back and forth, and people storm out. People are not involved in the project who used to be because they think it's too political. I always have to say, of course it's political. History, doing historical work is always political. We have to make choices about everything. So I love this work. And as a professor, I love bringing my students into doing this community-based work because they can see how messy it is. It destabilizes the conceit that history is a set of facts that just need to be told. Because clearly in my community, there is no set of facts that everyone agrees on. So then, yeah, at the end of the day, how do we do the work in a way that is ethical and caring and loving towards everyone's different truths, yet taking into account histories of marginalization and people whose stories and voices have been pushed to the side? How can we bring them back to the center? And do we have to massage the feelings of the people who have always been at the center, who then get pushed to the periphery? All of those things I see as the work of being a historian, but they're not the things that most people think of as being a historian. And so, yeah, I think my book is trying to really reveal some of that to readers.
Yeah, thank you for that. And related, some of the work that happens with histories, especially telling histories of marginalized folks, is making that history legible, or sometimes folks have said like it's a way of an act of recovery or uncovery, essentially bringing a history into focus. But something that I think about a lot is like, what are the drawbacks of making one legible? What's the drawback of making yourself legible? I often think about Stuart Hall, who says we have the right, like specifically Black folks have the right to be illegible. We don't have to explain ourselves. So I wonder how you like wrestled with that question of like, one, wanting to tell a story that is very deserved of being told and making more folks aware of it, but two, also holding the other part of that, like what happens when you are legible, or what happens when that becomes the focus of your work?
It's a great question, particularly around queer history, because I mean, think about the prevalence of the issue of outness in thinking about queer communities, to be out or to not be out, and which is people's choice. And yet to write a book is to out all of this history. It's making very visible things that have historically, strategically been invisible. And so, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of ethical questions for me as an author and us broadly as a project, because we've presented this stories not just it's not just in my book, but in exhibits and walking tours and whatever. Anytime we or publishing oral histories, anytime we tell any of these stories, we have to think about, are there risks and threats and dangers to the people whose stories are being told. In the oral histories, that comes up a lot. I write about in the trans chapter, I write about a former, a Black trans sex worker who told us her story, and all of the legal wildness we got into over whether we could even publish her story as she told it, and then thinking about censorship, but also legal liabilities and ethics of who gets to tell their story. And we do end up redacting a lot of her interview, which I regret, but it's the only way to get any of it out there. So that's an example of not of someone whose life was triply marginalized while they were alive, and they showed up in the newspapers a lot as a criminal defendant. And then in our project, she finally gets the chance to tell her story her way, and then we are invisibilizing parts of it and visibilizing others based on legal and ethical considerations that go well beyond like just passing her the mic, which she told her story the way she wanted to. So it's complicated. And then like in the chapter where I talk a lot about Black queer histories, E. Patrick Johnson and others have written about the ways that Black queer folks, kind of related to what you're talking about with Stuart Hall, like there's sort of strategic invisibilities that take place with a lot of the Black queer folks that we work with around different conceptions of what outness is. I mean, I think it's fair to say that our general discourse around outness is a white queer one, and the way that Black queer families and Black queer spaces operate here in Roanoke and elsewhere operate based on different logics than that. And yet to absorb it into the project and output it into exhibits or into the book or whatever, perhaps is taking it outside of that system in which visibility and invisibility operates, and making it visible in a new and perhaps dangerous way. So yeah, we have to think about all this stuff, and there have been names that have been changed, and even people who wanted to use their full names, I decided not to use people's last names in the book. So yeah, and I think that, and then finally, the last thing I'll tell you about that is that there's a lot of aspects of queer history that are not the kind of things that your kind of mainstream gays want the straights to find out about, if I can put it that way. We live in a time and place where like marriage equality is seen as like good gay, and public sex and sex work and criminal, informal economy stuff is seen as like, I've heard elders say like, let's leave that in the past, why, that's our dirty laundry kind of thing. And our project has always had a very sex positive attitude about this, and the book is full of stories about, like you mentioned, cruising before, stories about public sex, gay sex in wacky places, sex work and the lives and the voices of sex workers. And there has been some blowback by people in the community who are like, why are you telling those stories? That makes us look bad, that reinforces negative stereotypes, which are harmful, etc. And we have to listen to those critiques and negotiate that. But at the end of the day, like I said before, history is always about making political choices. And we've decided in our project to always like tell those stories without shame, because the shame around public sex and sex work and those kind of invisibilized stories, the shame around that is the biggest problem around it. That's the worst aspect of it, is the shame. And that's my view and the view of the other people in the project.
Wow, there's so much there.
I just ramble, so
No, it's all really good. Like my mind is going in 20 different directions. And I think this is, so bear with me, this is kind of an incomplete thought, but as I was reading the book, I was realizing in maybe a different way how much the law attempts to enclose and confine LGBTQ life. We just have like so much documentation of like the ways that the law is structuring our lives. And I wonder just how much people, and like it actually doesn't make sense, right? Like when I was reading about like what are considered felonies and like federal crimes, like sex acts that were considered federal crimes, it just like doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't do us any good. So I was wondering about like the ways that you and other project members dealt with the ways that the law is just like always there. Like I was always reading the law as a structure and even a character in the book. And I wondered if like that was apparent as you were like looking through the sources.
That's really interesting. I haven't thought about it that way in terms of the law. I absolutely did think a lot in writing the book about policing, and our project has looked at that a lot. We released a podcast episode last year about the history of queer people in policing in Roanoke. And I think that's a really important story. And of course, policing is just the execution of the law. So it's a criminal justice system. And it's all over there in the history, particularly in gay men's lives with cruising, but also attending the bars, because the bars themselves were illegal until the 90s. And then the trans women in the book, it's particularly the sex workers that I write about. I mean, it's just constantly living in relationship with police, in relationship with the criminal justice system that misgenders you, and in relationship with a public health system during the AIDS crisis, and how sex workers were seen as vectors of disease that needed to be quarantined and policed even further, policed out of existence. In relationship with a city government, we haven't talked about that aspect too, but that's a huge part of the book, is talking about Roanoke City's city government and the city council and their efforts to constantly try to plan their way out of having a queer city through urban planning and trying to pass laws to govern downtown space, which they're still doing to this day. They just passed an anti-homeless law last month, even though a lot of us queer folks went down to fight against it. So it shows you that it's living queer history. So yeah, I think that the stories in the book are in constant relationship with a criminal justice system. And that's an important story to tell in this era as well of the Black Lives Matter and post George Floyd protests of 2020, in that people are talking a lot about policing. And what we've tried to do here, working with the other community groups and abolitionist groups and Black Lives Matter groups in Roanoke, is to really think holistically about histories of policing and futures of policing, including queer and trans voices in it. And like a Black queer trans person was the leader of our abolitionist group here the past few years, who intersected with our project. So yeah, I think that this topic that you bring up is super relevant right now as we think about how queer histories of policing can help us rethink this moment of police abolition and whatever people are dreaming of today.
Yeah, thank you. I am gonna pop into the chat and look at some of the Q&A because our time is going by so quickly.
Okay.
But we have one anonymous attendee who asked, what were some of the histories that ended up on the cutting floor and why?
So we've done almost 50 oral history interviews over the past 7 years, maybe 40 of which ended up in the book. Most of the ones that didn't are more recent, so they just didn't end up in the book. But I think a lot of stories that ended up on the cutting room floor were, frankly, were ones that came from interviews with white cis gay men. And that goes back to the discussion we were having earlier about kind of visibility and invisibility and politics of doing the histories and stuff. When we started this project and was looking for people to tell their stories, we had a line of white cis gay men at the door who wanted to tell their stories. And those stories, there was a lot of stories about the bar life, which actually in the book, there's not that much about the bars. There's a little bit, but we could have told a lot more about the bar lives. But it turns out that the bar scene historically in Roanoke was very much white, cis, gay, male dominant. And that some of these bars explicitly had exclusionary policies towards Black people or towards trans people, hostile towards women or whatever. So I think that, early on in this project, I thought, oh, bars, gay bars, that's going to be so central to these stories. That's been kind of put to the side a bit by the time I wrote this book. I think also that, but because I am interested in geographies, thinking about space and place, the book doesn't do that much to talk about, say, people's feelings about religion, or people's love lives, or their views on their sexual lives, or their relationship with their families. That stuff is rich in the oral histories, and you could write books about kinship and family life and stuff. But because I was really interested in the ways people move through space and are policed around space and so on, a lot of that ended up on the cutting room floor.
Thank you. So this next question that I'm going to ask from the crowd, I'm asking as a way to get into one of the chapters that you talk about, like digital queerness. So this person asked, with the replacement of gay bars by social dating apps as the primary means of meeting people, are policing issues still a live political issue in Roanoke, other than sex worker and police conflicts? So yeah, I asked that as like their question, but also giving you the inroads to talk about digital queerness.
Right, yeah, so in the last chapter of the book, I talk about how queer people engage with the internet. And I'm trying to complicate the narrative around the internet being the cause of the demise of historically queer spaces. People argue that, people can meet online now and they don't go to gay bars anymore, or they go on Grindr instead of cruising, or they go to a porn website instead of the adult bookstores that used to be part of the fabric of our downtown. But yeah, I try to complicate that because I think that the way that queer people use the internet, and I show this with our local community and the stories we found, is that it's very hybrid. You know, people use the internet as ways of manifesting new physical spaces and physical encounters. Facebook and, yeah, mostly Facebook, where there's all of these weird local queer groups. There's like a Facebook group here in Roanoke that's basically just gay men, like selling their used furniture to each other. I forget what the group's called, but that's all I ever see posted there. And it's a very specialized kind of digital queer space. But I mean, you have to actually meet up with the person to hand off the furniture. And I have a very optimistic view about the role of the internet with queer space, because I think it reanimates it, like the guerrilla gay bar movement in the 2000s that used the internet to bring queer people together in space, to take over physical space in new ways. So I, but it is true that we don't see cruising as much in the public parks or the restrooms at the shopping mall and some of these historic spaces. And there are feelings of nostalgia for sure among the older gays about what's lost there, and feelings about, that there's good things too about having migrated to Grindr or whatever. But then the question of policing, yeah, absolutely. I mean, policing in Roanoke is extremely still influenced by race and racial segregation in the city, which we haven't talked about a lot here, but I write about in the book. Roanoke is still the geography of the city is still maps onto the Jim Crow era and redlining segregation that formed in the early 20th century. And policing is heaviest in Northwest Roanoke, which is the majority Black area where most Black queer people live too. I mean, we have a neighborhood where I live in Southwest Roanoke, which is historically all white during the Jim Crow period. And when it became a gay neighborhood, it was still all white. And now it's more mixed, but I live in a neighborhood that's mostly white. You don't see the policing in my neighborhood park that I write about in the book decades ago when it was a cruising location. But you still see intense policing of Black queer folks in Northwest Roanoke. So I think we have to think intersectionally about, it's not just policing queerness, but it's about policing. This is happening downtown too. I mentioned that law they just passed against homeless people, which the disproportionate percentage of homeless people are queer or trans and disabled, just to point that out too. And so the intersections of race and disability and queerness and transness is, we have to think about that when we think about the way policing operates. But absolutely, queer people are still under the thumb of some intense policing in this city.
Okay, I think this might be our last question. We might have time for two more, but this is a question and a statement. So this person says the work you've been doing in Roanoke is amazing, and also there's all these ethical questions you've shared regarding sharing certain stories, how people are named, etc., and writing a book about it. What made you want to convey this queer history, work, life in the form of a book? Or maybe put another way, or is there a different way that you would convey this work?
Yeah, thank you for this question. Yeah, I felt conflicted about this because writing this book did not have to be an individual endeavor, but it is. There's some cool queer history publications that have been collectively written, like the History Project in Boston put out a great book in the 90s that is like a local queer history work that's written collectively by their project. And the Twin Cities GLBT History Project put out a collective book. So writing a book can be a collective project, but I decided to write a personal book that weaves in my own there's some memoir and some own personal storytelling here. And thus I had to step away from the project a bit, in that the history project, which is still going on now in its 7th year, is designed in a way to try to always decentralize itself and be as democratic as possible. And so when we've made things, which we've made a podcast and we've made exhibits and we've done walking tours and we've done interactive theater programs with youth and we've done zine making and just on and historical reenactments and all the wild stuff that I write about in the book. Whenever we've done those projects, those have been collective endeavors that we've decided as a collective that those are the ways to tell those stories. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And I'm self-critical of some of our programming in the book, where maybe we put on an event that we thought would be the appropriate kind of format for the story we're telling. And the audience that came out was not the one we hoped for, or maybe the event trivialized the story that we thought should be more serious or something. So, but in writing the book, I decided that I stepped back from the project for a bit the past few years, and COVID helped with that too, to step back and to think more personally, because I wanted to write about the project. So to kind of step back and look at my community and the work we've been doing. How have we done it? How has it been fucked up the way we've done it? What have we done well? What have we not? I wanted to step back and look at myself, as Aaliyah and I were talking about, like, how was I shaped by this work? And how did my own emerging transness and my transition and my emerging dykeness and et cetera, like, how did that, when I look back, how do I see the messiness of how it shaped my approach to the work and how the work shaped my own identity? And yeah, so I that was a decision that I made to kind of tell my version of the story, hopefully to help show what we were talking about earlier this evening, that doing queer history work has this overflowingness intersecting with our lives as queer people. And I wanted to show that through my own embodiment and my own experience.
And then just this question to close us out, what did writing and living this history teach you that you would like to share with others?
I think, just to bring it back to where we started, I think that it made me rethink what queer community can look like for me. It made this thing about falling in love with this community. This question of belonging, which is in the title of my book, it made me think a lot about what it means to belong to a place, to belong to a genealogy, to belong to a community of people that I've worked so intimately with in this work, people who have challenged me and helped me grow. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there. But yeah, the work has been very personal and profound for me, and it's kind of interesting because I don't know what I really want to work on when you think about my career as a historian or a writer, whatever that aspect of this. I'm still going to be a queer person living in this house in Roanoke, and that part I'm so happy about and I love. But in terms of like what I might research or write about, I don't know, because this has felt like I can't imagine a project that would be more personal than this, and more resonant with who I am and how I want to live my life right now. So so the project's meant a lot to me.
Oh, that's such a wonderful way to end out our conversation together. So I'll turn it back over to you, Chelsea.
Well, thank you so much. I think I could have gone on listening to you two chat for another hour. I'm sad that we have to go. Also, Samantha, I want to apologize that we at Politics and Prose failed to mention your doctorate, and I hate doing that. So
No,
I'm sorry that we didn't address you properly at the top of the hour, but thank you also for your graciousness. And as most of you know, we were going to be in store and we had to move it to this virtual setting. So thank you very much for making the transition so easy. Thank you for joining us, all of you out there. Thank you as well. As a gentle reminder, I've placed the link in the chat to purchase Living Queer History. It'll take you to the Politics and Prose website where you can purchase the book. And while you're there, we hope you check out the events page, and we'd love to see you soon. In the meantime, everyone stay well and well read. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye.